Hello and welcome to the Teaching Transformations podcast, a collaboration between the Academy for Sustainable Futures and the Careers and Enterprise Service at Canterbury Christ Church University. I'm your host, Jack Swan. In this podcast, we interview lecturers and course leaders and ask them how they've managed to embed sustainability into their course and their teaching. Dr Ivan Khovacs teaches primarily in the areas of Christian doctrine, systematic theology, and theology and literature, and oversees teaching in pastoral theology too. He also directs theological education and directs MA dissertations on subjects such as ministerial theology and ordained ministry, in partnership with Church of England Diocese of Rochester, Southwark and Canterbury, as well as the Franciscan International Study Centre. As always, I began by asking Ivan how he connects these ideas of sustainability with his teaching of theology. So Ivan, fantastic to have you with us. Can you tell us a little about how you've embedded sustainability into the theology courses that you teach on?
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for this opportunity to talk a bit and also to review and think about where I've been with teaching sustainability in the context of theology, religious studies, philosophy, and ethics at Canterbury Christ Church. I used to teach a course called Practical Theology, which is, as it says on the tin, how do you get students out into places where theology is put into practice? Hospices, hospitals, places of care, places of vulnerability with homeless people with mental health issues or developmental disabilities and so on, and to get them to appreciate that the concepts and the sometimes very abstract concepts that we learn in theology, like kenosis or like incarnation or the Trinity, actually have a real life outworking in the lives of people and how people give themselves to make the other lives of people, other people's lives better. But in the course of doing that, I discovered that my own passion for the natural world and my own passion for food and for going to find where food comes from, going to the wineries, going to the farms, talking to farmers, talking to people who grow food and the challenges that they have around that, and learning from them and learning to cook recipes that are a challenge to me that I've not come across before. I began to see that could in itself become a form of pedagogy and a form of opening up some problems that students could relate to. So the problems of sustainability, the problems of the environment are huge, and we talk about climate crisis and climate change, and the numbers are astronomical. It's very difficult for us to relate to that on a human level. But as human beings, we're storytellers, and we're people that relate emotionally to things. We connect with things on an emotional level eventually. And for me, it was about helping students to connect with the problems of sustainability and the problems of climate change and the problems of the environment on a level that they could understand. So how could we start a conversation about food, where your food comes from, how your food arrived on your plate, the different combination of things, where it came from, what the various ethical challenges may have been along the way. And that was a unit within my practical theology course. When the academic framework changed in our theology and religious studies program, I developed this religion and the ethics of sustainability course. And within that, I've been expanding, and really all the seeds that I had planted before really began to flourish. And students really enjoy it.
Tell us how you've put that into practice then. So you're drawing on all these different ideas and experiences and viewpoints. What then happens in the classroom over those 12 weeks and in the reading outside the classroom, if they're doing the job? What does that look like? What does that look like in practice?
Like any course, there's set reading, and the reading is going to be about theology, philosophy, religion, ethics, and the questions of sustainability on that kind of level. So that theoretical engagement is is always there. That's the foundation of everything we do. However, day one, the question I began with is, when was the last time you peeled a potato? And I ask that question because I suspect that very few, if any, of the students have any experience of that, and that experience has shown that. But also to help them to understand just how distant we are from the food that we eat. And we live in a very, very strange period in human history where the food on our plate, what we put into our bodies, very frequently has gone through many processes of preparation, of presentation, of transportation, and of bringing it to market in a way that makes us absolutely disconnected to where that food originated, whether it's a potato in the ground or whether it was an animal on a farm somewhere in the countryside, or a piece of fish somewhere in the Far East. And to retrace that history, to retrace those steps, and to say, do you realize how connected we are to seemingly faraway continents that increasingly, with issues of climate change, for example, we will begin to recognize are actually rather small distances, that we really are connected to the lives of people who grow our rice, and we really are connected to the lands that are being desiccated and desertified in places like the Andes in Bolivia, because something like quinoa becomes a superfood that is highly sought after in Europe, in Britain, in North America. And the thirst and the premium that we put on these kinds of foods turn out to have incredible and oftentimes very negative impacts on those places of origin. So that connection with food, connection with the big issues through a perspective that they could understand and relate to, is where that question, when was the last time you peeled a potato, comes from.
Yeah, it's a really obvious place to actually start the sustainability conversation, because so often we tend to think sustainability and then just go bang, green stuff, and we think about it purely in the lens of climate change, and very, very important lens. That's my main interest in it as well. But it's also thinking about biodiversity, it's thinking about economic justice, it's thinking about social justice. And like you say, this one issue of just food, you're talking about food miles, you're talking about production standards, you're talking about clearing of forests to create, grasslands, pasture land, that kind of thing. So you're really opening things up. Yes. And then within the context of theology, which is what you're teaching, you then also have a very overarching framework ready to apply. So you start with question one, then day one of the course. What else is going on? What happens in the subsequent weeks? What are students being taught? What are they being exposed to? What are they being asked to think about? How are they being tested and assessed on all this?
Yeah, so from those very practical questions, and we will carry that through all the way through in the course, but we'll also look at, for example, there's a basic notion in Christianity, as there is in other traditions, that God loves the world that God has made, that God has made the world a good place, and a place for flourishing and for life, that ought to be life-giving. And anything we do to take away from that and to make it a place that where there's biodiversity loss, where people suffer hunger and disease as a result of the damage that we've done to the environment. But this really has to question what it means for us to be human beings in the 21st century, in this highly advanced, the most technologically advanced age that has ever been. And with all the tools that we have at our disposal, we nevertheless find ourselves making these negative impacts on the natural environment. So what we're reading about is, for example, the concept of deep, dark religion. It's not a Christian concept. It's a sort of overarching concept around the study of religion, and whether the place of religion in bringing human beings and making human beings responsible for the natural world and for other living creatures has now been displaced by a narrative of the human person at the center of everything, anthropocentrism. That is there in Christianity, and we have to own up to that. People like me, who are leaders within the church tradition, have to own up to that. But it's there in other traditions as well, and it's certainly there in contemporary modern highly advanced technological cultures that we live in. Are there alternatives to anthropocentrism? Are there ways of looking at biocentrism? Are we one of many other species of which we happen to be the rational thinking, storytelling part of the natural world? Are there alternatives to that? Is there any contribution that, for example, a Christian tradition or a biblical tradition that says that God sees the world as good in itself, not for what value it gives to us, not for what it produces for us, not for what we can take from it, but a wood, a forest, an ocean, a mountain, a rock is in itself of great beauty to God. The Bible celebrates this, and historically, worship traditions, prayer traditions in Christianity and within Judaism, the biblical traditions have celebrated this. What has gone wrong that we have separated ourselves from that? And how can we begin to recover some of those strands that will bring us back in touch with this? So there's the practical, there's the theoretical, there's the point of these abstract concepts of creation, of incarnation, of new creation that we see, for example, in the Bible, coming to roost in our thinking about environmental sustainability in the classroom.
And how do students respond to that? I mean, you're dealing with theology students, so I'm expecting them to come in with a degree of being open to these big questions rather than, no offense to any engineers listening, but perhaps those coming in with a sort of more nuts and bolts approach. But do you find them wrestling with these issues? Do you find any of them rejecting it? Or do they find this is all material they're actually very open to and go on an adventure with?
Well, let me say something about the latter in a bit, about teaching this with students outside of the theological disciplines and philosophical disciplines. But I find students, and particularly have to say in this generation, hugely open. They're hungry for ways of making connection, of finding meaning between their own lives and the world outside themselves, the way in which they see the world breaking down around them. If they're able to sense that they can make a difference, they can touch a certain space and find a footprint where they can make a difference in the world, it's huge to them. Jack, I know you came in, of course, you came into the classroom to walk us through some exercises on our carbon footprint, for example, in which you'll remember I turned out to be the absolute worst offender when it came to that. It's, of course, to the students' great delight. And some of them were very, very, very good about that, partly because they live far more simply than a professional person will, and have far fewer commitments than my commitments in London with the church community, my commitments here with teaching or going away to conferences for academic work. But that very way of understanding things and looking at things seems to make sense to them. And I think it's partly because they've been bombarded with messages of pessimism, with doom and gloom scrolling, and with a whole age of pandemic. Now we're looking back for over 4 years. That has been a major part of their growing up years. And to find a place where they can have conversation that begins not with the negative, not with the destructive, it begins with what we can do, what we can look forward to, the kind of future that we can construct together, has been hugely well received. But that's students in theology, that's students in religious studies. Now, we also have some students that are combined honors. And we always seem to have students that come from business, for example. This year has been no exception, and I've been hugely privileged to be in conversation with those students about their work in business ethics. We had one student who did a business placement for a year in a food distribution center in Peterborough, and we got to see that's the industry and their side of the story and the kinds of challenges that they face. Even in something like tracing the origin or tracking the origins and the various places that foods travel in order to get to our supermarkets. So that's been a huge contribution. Now, I actually began teaching this years ago at the University of St. Andrews, where I did my doctorate degree. And I was teaching to students who came from the sciences, from geology, from biology, from earth science, from mathematics, and other disciplines as well. So I very early on learned to translate my work into ways in which students could understand that. But again, my experience has been exactly the same, that where students find not the doom and gloom, not the naysayism, but rather that the a way of thinking that says creation is a good thing, the world in which we live is worth investing in and living well with, and it's worth now making peace with in the face of the environmental disasters that we see around us. And that will make a difference to who we are, to the communities that we touch, and eventually to the world more broadly.
What's really interesting about that is, as you know, I am a trainee teacher. And some months ago, I ran a session at my placement college. And during this, we were talking about carbon footprinting, we were talking about climate change. It was all in the run-up to COP28. And I was very struck by some of the early discussions in the class, which was a frustration of being taught the same stuff yet again. Yes, the planet's in a bad shape. And they were insistent, they were begging on, what can we do about it? We're tired of being told it's a problem. Give us some answers, give us some kind of solutions. And these are students who are 17, so you'll be working with 19, 20, 21-year-olds in your case. But yeah, there's that real appetite to be shown either solutions or a framework to solutions, which is what you're describing, or like a series of perspectives that they can then go and identify with their own understandings. Okay, going back to your example of food, well, where's the issue here with the food mileage? How can we reduce that? How can we improve the standards of labour and the conditions people are working in at the point of production or at packaging or at sale? So really interesting to have all that. I'm aware that you're doing some further work on this, looking at some perhaps work across the university with it. Yes. And no doubt that will be shaped by your own reflections on how this module has been taught so far. So perhaps looking at the teaching you've done on this so far, what are the areas that you would say need to be improved on, the areas that you and colleagues can grow and continue to enhance the strength, the intriguingness of teaching sustainability? What do you feel on that one?
Yes, it's been a great privilege to come across a number of colleagues across the university in different disciplines, in natural sciences, in education, for example, in sociology, in policing and lawmaking, and to find that they share so many of my own concerns, coming from their own disciplines, from their own diversity of beliefs and understandings of things. I feel that is perhaps the greatest strength that we have at this university, and that we could develop in any university, is the strength of interdisciplinarity, reaching across our areas of comfort, our areas of expertise, and speaking to another colleague who speaks a language that we don't understand, and to have to struggle with that language that we don't understand, and to have to struggle with modeling. I am not one for graphs, I have to tell you that. I was hugely grateful that you presented some really interesting and graphically visually interesting graphics on the carbon footprint, for example. But even that, I really have to decode and decipher that, because it isn't my natural environment. By the same token, I realize that the kinds of abstract concepts that I take for granted, including the notion of God, for example, that is for many people a very difficult space to have a conversation in. But to reach across those differences of subject area, of expertise, of approaches, of pedagogies, that has been huge. So I think I would say that teaching as a vocation, teaching and research as a way of living, as a way of understanding the world and finding our own way into problems in the world, has been further confirmed for me as something that requires that interdisciplinarity. And again, students have responded really well to that. We've had a wealth, really an embarrassment of riches in the external presenters that we've brought into the classroom this year, from Natural England, from Arosha International, a conservation outfit that works around the world, from presenters from other universities, and from people that are working and doing things locally in Kent as well, and in the Southeast. And again, for students to see that no one of us can do things alone. I don't for a minute pretend that religion is the answer or that Christianity has all the answers. Not at all. But rather that there is a way in, there's a framework in which we can begin a conversation. But that's only a beginning. I can say within Christianity, this is an understanding that creation is a good thing and that God takes humanity from creation to a new creation. How can that help us to envision the kind of future that we can build on in conversation with people from other disciplines, other personal convictions, other ethical commitments and understandings of what it means to be human in the world?
So your main reflection there is the value of being interdisciplinary and having these conversations and bringing in expertise from elsewhere. Kind of on that line, is there any other advice that you would offer to colleagues who are thinking about the ways they can embed sustainability in the content they teach and how they go about teaching it?
I would say it's actually the other way around. It's other colleagues who have taught me to be that much more practical and hands-on in my approaches to teaching. This is what I'm learning from my colleagues in the sciences who work in a laboratory, for example, colleagues in economics who model problems in order to better understand the bigger issues behind them. So for me, taking students out into an organic farm, for example, to see animals in situ, where they live, where they thrive, to talk to farmers. We happen to be incredibly lucky here in Canterbury. We have a former theology student. He and his wife, David and Chloe began an organic farm just outside Canterbury, Oink and Udder. And they raise cattle. They raise goats and they raise pigs. And each of those breeds have different needs and different roles that they play, get this, in renewing the soils that they pasture in, right? So they move their animals around various farms, various soils, various parts of the southeast. And the role of those animals is to eventually to provide nourishment for people. They go to the abattoir. Those that are not continuing to breed will go to the abattoir and become served as food. But what they will do within their lifetime is trample on the ground and encourage and create the kinds of soils that we need for grasses to grow that are native to this part of the country. And some of these places have not seen that for many generations. So to take students out there on the farm, to get them to see the animals, to talk to the farmers, and then to say, now look at your feet right now. Everything begins with soil. Everything begins with and goes back to the ground. And this is what we're eventually living for, to create good soil in which we can thrive, we can grow, raise families, and plan a hopeful future.
So that theme really coming through of connectedness, of rootedness, of getting one sense of perspective outside the self, outside of the human picture and into the world more widely. That's really something that can in its own way be found for every discipline. There will be some way of relating all disciplines to that. Well, the final question then, and this has been really enlightening, Ivan, do you have any final pieces of advice or thoughts that you'd like to share with colleagues?
I think just not to be afraid to pursue one's passions. The reason we go into university work, academic work, and teaching is something drove us. There's a niche that we have to scratch. There was some question, and oftentimes, and most likely questions that we have no answers to. Who are we? Where do we come from? Why are we here? Is there meaning to all this? Where are we going? Those are the big questions in life. And in some way, those of us who went into academics and have found our way to university are working with those big questions still, trying to approach those questions from different directions and different places. And sometimes with the kinds of restraints and constraints that we have, economic, student enrollments, university growth or shrinkage, or even the value of universities in a contemporary world that sees economics and turning people out who are productive and able to contribute to the economy as the most important thing. We're actually working away from that and saying we will turn out students that are great, compassionate, givers to the world around them and to communities that they touch. But they will have been changed in here in terms of who they are and at the core, because they will have learned to pursue those questions of deep value in their own way, following their own convictions. So my advice would be to students and to academics, don't be afraid to pursue your passions. It's hard to raise something and put something out to another colleague and say, do you think this has any legs? I just had an email yesterday from a colleague in the sciences saying, I'm thinking of doing this conference of sustainability in this other area. Do you think there's something on this? And it took me about an hour to send the reply, because I wanted to put together a very small paragraph to say, I think yes, and I think maybe it's about sustainability and imagination and the arts, and how can the arts help us to grow our deep affinities for the world that we live in and for our own place in it. But yes, it's a risk, and you always risk someone else saying, well, I don't really understand what you mean, or it's not really where I'm coming from. But it's a risk worth taking, and I think that's what I've learned, and that's what I would leave people with.
Amazing. Thank you so much for all your thoughts there. I really appreciate it, and best of luck with all the endeavors going forward in new module creation and teaching next year.
Thank you so much, and I look forward to conversation with you in the future.
Thanks very much. Thanks once again to Ivan Khovacs for joining us and sharing his experiences of embedding sustainability within theology teaching at Canterbury Christ Church University. Thanks for joining us on the Teaching Transformations podcast. The podcast is a collaboration between the Academy for Sustainable Futures and the Careers and Enterprise Service at Canterbury Christ Church University. I've been your host, Jack Swan. Production and video editing is handled by Harry Cooper. The video version of the podcast was recorded by Harry King and Drew Shelley Winfield. Audio design and editing is managed by Matt Crawley. Additional equipment and recording space was organised by James Sanford and Kiara Hewer. Distribution and promotion is organised by Bethany Clemson. Special thanks go to Andrew Lombard and Felicity Brambling Wells for all their support in helping us put together this Teaching Transformations podcast.